morning, TechDays. Wow, so many people. And no one that answers. Good morning, TechDays.
Good morning.
Better. Okay, so it's a real honor to be here at the TechDays. It's the 10th edition, but also it's kind of unique. I'm one of the few dynamic speakers, so that's kind of an honor. My name is Wim Korvits. I work as a lead expert at Delaware Consulting, and I'm also a Dynamics CRM MVP. Our topic today is about Dynamics CRM and SharePoint better together. The objectives really are, of course, why are they better together? What is the out-of-the-box experience that is offered by Microsoft? But then we're going to look further. What are my extensibility possibilities? How can I extend the out-of-the-box experience? And what are some common scenarios and typical integration patterns? Now, the whole goal at the end of the session is not that you become an expert in, a Dynamics CRM and SharePoint integrator. You're probably already an expert in one of the two, or maybe both of them. But the goal is really also to understand the possibilities and sparkle your imagination so that the next time that you need to combine the two, that you can create really an amazing solution. Now, for the agenda, it's pretty simple. We start with the basics, the better together, why, the out-of-the-box experience, and then we go and beyond that, extending it, some common scenarios, and then the not-so-common scenarios. It's not that they are more challenging or more difficult, it's just that they are less common. So let's start with the better together. Why are they better together? And it's pretty simple. It's because they are complementary. If you look at the bottom line first, and we'll look at CRM, and one thing to notice there is, if I say CRM, or when you read CRM, I'd like that you think of custom relationship management and not per se of customer relationship management. CRM or Dynamics CRM is really an application which you can use to create relational applications. So by definition, these relational applications, they are structured. The things you do in there, the objects you manage, the relations you manage, the tasks and activities you're doing, well, they are all in that specific structure. So it's almost as if you're always working according to a formalized process. Of course, you still have a bunch of freedom, but you can really move around, and at the end, you're always doing the same things. You're creating objects and relating those together. Because of that, it's typically also that the people working with that application know the relational model very good. If you think about classical Dynamics CRM with sales, marketing, and service, well, in that case, it's typically sales, marketing, and service people. But if you create your own application on top of the CRM platform, and you go around project management, it will be project managers. And they know their domain, and that's one of the reasons, if you look, they're always typically applications within their teams or within domains, because it's about a certain relational model. Because of that, if you look back to the data querying and filtering, that's probably also the reason why the search capabilities within Dynamics CRM are not that advanced. It's because you typically know what you're doing in the system, you know the relational model. So it's more about querying and setting parameters that you know what you're querying. It's your objects, it's your relational model that you know, it's the things you work with every day. Now, if you look at the opposite side of the spectrum, we have SharePoint. And SharePoint, targeted at the information worker, is around creating, managing, versioning data and information. So by definition, this is more around unstructured or semi-structured data. Interactions going in all directions. Social engagement, collaboration is highly encouraged. So you don't have these formalized processes or this specific structure like you would have on Dynamics CRM. Now, in that case, search becomes really important. Because there is no structure, you don't know what you will find. You have a clue, but search becomes really important. Basically, search is there to help you find what you need based on, some of the information that you might have. Because of the nature of these kind of applications, it's typically also cross-domain, cross-department, cross-team. Now, if we summarize that, it's pretty simple. If you look at SharePoint typically very good in the unstructured world and becomes less okay in the structured environment. Okay, I know there are some basic possibilities, you can create relationships, but well, they are kind of limited. The opposite side, of course, you have CRM, which is extremely good in the structured side, but it becomes less powerful and the unstructured working. So it's pretty simple. Why are they better together? Because, well, instead of this square triangle, you get almost a square of possibilities. You're bridging the best of these two worlds. Simply imagine one example where, well, I said, okay, CRM applications are typically within a team, but within that team, you might have information that you want to expose to the entire organization. If you have customers, well, it might be useful that whenever someone is creating a document on SharePoint, that you know for which account, for which customer, that document is created. So what if I can bridge the two worlds and I can say, well, whenever I need to add the metadata to my document, I can select my customer from my CRM system, where I have my customers in a structured way, without having to duplicate or write the name of the customer myself. So this is just one of the common scenarios, and we'll be talking about a few others in a minute. Now, what do we get out of the box? The out-of-the-box experience is good, but it's also pretty basic. What it comes down to is a visual integration of the SharePoint document management features within Dynamics CRM. So you can do everything you want on document management. You have storage, you have check-in, check-out, versioning, all these things visually integrated in CRM. So you don't have to leave the CRM environment to store and manage documents. So for those users that are working in the structured side of the application, that's extremely useful. To set this up, it's pretty simple. It's a two-step setup. First, you need to install a SharePoint solution, and then you simply configure Dynamics CRM, as we'll see in a minute during the demo. So you simply specify which SharePoint site you're using, and then you enable the entities. There's one important thing in regards to provisioning, because out of the box, what CRM is doing is creating a document library per CRM entity. So when you create an entity like an account or maybe a project or a customer or a car or whatever, it creates a document library for that entity. And every time you create a record, it creates a folder in that document library. So that's what is happening out of the box. And I'll just do a little demo on that to show you the possibilities. So I'm here within my Dynamics CRM environment, and setting up SharePoint, well, is basically through the settings. You have this document management option, and there you see, well, basically the first step, install the list component. Now, don't imagine too much here. Install list component is just a link to the Microsoft download site where you can download the list component, and then you still need to install it manually yourself. So it doesn't automate that for you. Once you have the list component downloaded, you basically have to configure it on SharePoint. You upload the solution basically, and I already did that to win some time. So we see here that the CRM list component has been installed as a solution and has already been activated. One of the things is that this solution is a sandbox solution, so you can also use that with SharePoint Online. Okay. The next step is to configure Dynamics CRM, document management settings. You simply say, okay, for which entities do I want to enable document management? And I already configured that, and I have account, contacts, but you can select any entity you want. Also, if you create your own custom entities, like I now did for project, you can enable that for document management. You specify the location, and that's it. In the next step, it's simply going to ask you what kind of structure you want to use when it's creating folders. And as a third step, it will create document libraries for you. So the document libraries are created at the time that you configure Dynamics CRM. Okay, so I'll just click Next. And then it's going to see that, well, actually, these document libraries are already created, and it doesn't have to create it for me now. So at a later stage, if you're adding entities, that's perfectly possible, and then it will simply create those document libraries for those new entities. Fine. So let's go to one of the items on which I have document management enabled, like an account, and see what it offers within CRM. So if I create a new account, which is basically like a customer, let's call it TechDays, when I save it, it only saves a CRM record. At this point, nothing happened in SharePoint. It's only on demand that it will create a folder in SharePoint. So when I go to the Documents navigation item here, it's going to send a request to the list component on SharePoint. The list component will notice that there is no folder yet for this record on SharePoint, and it will ask if you want to create one. And I'm going to do so. And then it creates a folder within that document library which was configured. And as you can see, it's going to visually integrate right here within Dynamics CRM, and I have all the possibilities. Now know that it creates one location for me automatically or on demand. You can add extra locations. So if you want to link one entity with multiple storage locations on SharePoint, that's also possible, and then your user can switch between them. Now this is the view on our SharePoint folder in our document library of accounts. And I can then, do the regular stuff, which I can also do on SharePoint. I can items, I can browse for a file, the new text document, which is extremely popular during these demos. I can provide my properties. So you recognize from the screens you're getting now that these are the SharePoint screens, right? And then they're added here. The columns you're getting, the metadata which you're having in CRM, is also the metadata you configure on SharePoint. So all the actions are there. You can check in, check out, do your versioning, do everything you need. You can open SharePoint location directly from here. And let's do that for a minute. If I configure, for example, on this library, that I'd like to have an extra column, on my view, then automatically this column will also appear in my CRM integration. So this is really an integration. You see the folder that was created, the TechDays, with the new text document in it. If I now turn back to CRM, I'm just going to close it for a minute. See if I can find my account back. If I now go to Documents, I will really see that the extra column, account name, is also added here on my view. So this is really just a view on what's happening on SharePoint. So if you need extra metadata, you can do that. The thing you're noticing already is, hey, it's not copying the account name to my document. It's not synchronizing any of the metadata. All the information I have on my account, it's not because I have an account name attribute on SharePoint that it's actually copying that to SharePoint. So this will be one of the common scenarios that we will talk about. How can I synchronize this metadata that I have an account name on my account and that on my document, if I store them, that I have that account name there too. So that people that have different roles and are mainly using SharePoint also see that this document was for a certain account, even if it gets moved to somewhere else, because I know it's now in the folder of this account. Okay, let's switch back to the slides for a moment. Okay. So what do we learn from this out-of-the-box experience? It's about document management. All the SharePoint document management feature visually integrated in CRM. It creates the SharePoint locations on demand. These are the three main points about the out-of-the-box experience. There is nothing else. Except, of course, a bunch of extensibility points and an SDK so that you can extend it yourself. And that's what we will be doing in the next steps. So let's go beyond the basics. Let's take a look at some of the extensibility points and some common scenarios. One very common scenario asked by customers and users is, hey, I want to control and I want to automate the provisioning. Now every time that I create a new record, I need to click on the Documents link, and only then the right location is created on SharePoint. Now that's okay, but in certain situations, you immediately want the right location on SharePoint too, because maybe not all of your users are using the CRM as a user interface. Some other users are using SharePoint as a user interface. So for them, they want that folder also as soon as an account or as soon as a project is created. Another thing is, I also want to control the storage. Maybe I don't want a folder. Maybe I want the entire document library for a certain record. Or maybe I want a document set. Or maybe I want an entire site. So that's one very common scenario. Another one is that you want to expose your CRM data to SharePoint, so that people working in SharePoint can also use the CRM data as metadata on their documents. I'm creating a document, for which customer is it, for which project is it, to what kind of data do I want to link that? And this data is very well managed and structured in the CRM system. So that's a common scenario. Now, as soon as you start doing that, all that data becomes also available for search. And then you really have an enterprise search that when you're looking for something, that you're not just looking inside SharePoint, but maybe also in your line of business applications, maybe in your CRM applications too. And the third one is pretty broad. I know it's about combining, composing, and collaborating. It's very broad, but very often it's about bridging the best of the two worlds. What if I want a discussion board whenever there's a new incident in the system? Yeah. Okay, I can control the provisioning so that the discussion board is created. And then I'll probably want to compose, I will probably want to create a mashup where I want to integrate the discussion board right within Dynamics CRM so that I can follow what's happening there. For realizing these scenarios, there's a bunch of extensibility points. Now, the first one that we're going to discuss here is from CRM to, basically to whatever. For the topic today, it's going to be SharePoint, but what are my options if I want to connect CRM to something else? There's two main elements. There's plugins and there's workflows. For those coming from the SharePoint world, compare plugin to an event receiver. So it's basically a bunch of business code, it's a bunch of business logic, your own code that you can hook into the system. Whenever something happens in the system and you want your custom code to be executed, you can use a plugin. You can do that synchronous, asynchronous, pre or post the operation that happens. So this is the perfect opportunity to control the provisioning. Let's say that when I create a project, I want to create a project site on SharePoint. Well, the perfect place to do that is to use a plugin. The second option is a workflow, which is based on Windows Workflow Foundation. And what you can do is you can extend the workflow steps that you have available. Now, the nice thing about this is workflow steps can be exposed to end users. Plugins are hidden. These are a developer feature. Workflow steps can be exposed to end users. So that means that the user for himself can design a workflow and decide, hey, if this happens, I want to create something on SharePoint. So he can create his own workflow and say, whenever I create an opportunity that is worth more than 100,000 euros, I want to create a site. And in all other cases, I just create a folder for this opportunity. So this can be automated using workflows or plugins. Depends on who is going to use that. The plugin really a developer feature, and workflow can also be exposed to the end users. So from there on, what do? We can connect back to CRM, of course, or we can go to SharePoint. And SharePoint offers a bunch of services there. Best practice, according to documentation, is to use the client object model. There's also the REST endpoint if you just want to create or manage some data. There's also still the good old ASMX web services. I'm not sure about the good, but they're all at least. I see that, if you speak to SharePoint developers and you ask them, okay, we need to communicate with SharePoint and we cannot use the client object model, they're kind of getting a cold when they hear that, hey, I have to use the ASMX web services. What they prefer to do typically is, hey, is it not an idea that we use a server object model, which is only available on the server, and then expose that using a custom web service? And sometimes that's a very valid idea, because the server object model can do much more than what you can do with the ASMX web services which are exposed. The only problem and the only thing that you have to think about is, where is my SharePoint, where is my CRM? Are these in an online environment, in a sandboxed environment, or are these on premises, on my own servers? Because in online, you cannot deploy your custom web service to the SharePoint online. Opposite idea, CRM online, and using the client object model is also a problem. because you're in a sandbox environment, these client object model assemblies are not available on the CRM online servers. So these are things that you should think about. Okay, let's go to a little demo and do some controlled provisioning. Okay. So, sure. Okay, thank you, technical support. So what I'll do is create a new project. And if you download the latest version of the SDK, there's the CRM Developer Toolkit. And the CRM Developer Toolkit actually offers some project templates for working with Dynamic CRM. So I'm going to use that one. You can use a specific project, or you can go for the solution. I'll just create a new project, TechDays, as the solution template. First thing it asks is, where is your CRM server? In this case, it's local. I'm going to connect. Next question will be about security. How am I logging in? And then which organization am I connecting to? Hopefully. Okay. It's taking its time. So why does it need this connection? Further on, we're going to see that there's this CRM Explorer. The CRM Explorer allows me to view all my entities in CRM, and I can immediately manage them also from within CRM, from within Visual Studio. So let's connect here. I see it's true. Log on. My organization, it's multi-tenant, so it's possible there's multiple organizations. And then the solution. The solution is important because everything is created will be deployed in this solution. So if you don't have created solutions yet on CRM before, you first go and create, or the best idea is to first create the solution on CRM, and then only start then with the Visual Studio project so that you can link everything you create to that specific solution you created in CRM. Okay. So it will go off. It creates a few projects like the CRM package, which is used for deploying everything, the plugins assembly, and a workflow assembly. Then also what it will also create is Silverlight assemblies. I'm not going to do that because I don't need that. But if you want to expose, like create Silverlight web resources, the template will provide these options. Actually, I don't need the workflow assembly either. I just need the plugins. First thing to do is make sure that your assembly is strongly named. So you need to sign your assembly or else you will never be able to deploy. So I'll do that immediately before I forget. And then I can start developing my plugins. Now what the project offers me is a base template or a base class that I can reuse for all my plugins. Now instead of doing that, I'm going to move to the CRM Explorer, which is a view offered, which I can use to, well, the name says it, explore CRM. I can see all my entities, and I can see all the elements which are in my solution. So from here, as I said, I can open up and start configuring my entity. If I need to add fields or create relations, I can do that directly from within Visual Studio. I don't have to leave the environment if I forgot something small, for example. What I also can do is just right-click a certain entity and say, hey, I want to create a plugin for this. It will pop up a window asking, okay, you're going to create a plugin for project. When do you want to execute this code? On which message? So on the create, update, on assigning. We'll do it on create, because the idea is that whenever a project is created, I want to create a site on SharePoint. So on the create, when, before or after the operation, I'll go for after, and then I can choose synchronous or asynchronous. I would usually go for asynchronous because I don't want to wait for that, but now for the demo, so that I don't have to refresh all the time, I'll just go for synchronous, and I'll execute it on the server. So that's what I need. I click on OK, and it creates the plugin. So it inherits from the base class plugin, which was already in the template, and then it foresees some of the code, and I can start immediately focusing on writing my business logic. So all of the typical plumbing code that you need usually for creating a plugin is already done by the developer toolkit and by the project templates which you get from the developer toolkit. Now, what do we want to do? We want to talk to SharePoint now. So we have two options, as we said. We can talk with the client object model, or we can talk to the ASMX web services. Talking to the client object model, what you will need is the client object model assemblies. I'll just reference those. So you have SharePoint.client.dll and the client runtime assembly. And then I can start working with SharePoint. I don't have to add references or service references for this, it's just using the client object model. Now, you don't want to see me typing all the code, it's going to take for ages, so I prepared some plugins. Hooray for plugins. So what's happening in this plugin? I've created a little helper method, create SharePoint site using the client object model. So the first thing that happens, or what you need to do, is create a client context and provide where you're connecting to. Then, when you have that location, you can get the site which is there and add a new site to it. So using some web creation information, so I'm providing the name, the description, the location, and also the template. Now here you can see that I have a default property or parameter template, which is set to a custom template. So I've created a specific site template for projects. You could, of course, define any template and use that as a template for the sites you want to be creating whenever a project is created in CRM. Very important is the execute query, because this makes sure that everything is sent to CRM. When you're using this client object model on SharePoint, it seems as if you're using or working with a local assembly, and you are, but behind the scenes it's still communicating with web services. So this execute query makes sure that everything is sent to the web service, that everything is sent to the SharePoint server. The next thing I'm doing is not that important for this demo, but important for later on. From CRM, we know what we're doing. We're creating the SharePoint site, and we can store the site we created. So CRM always knows where is my storage. Later on, if you want to do some metadata synchronization and make sure that if something happens on SharePoint, that you can communicate back to CRM that something changed, your SharePoint environment should also know, okay, where is my CRM record? What is my associated CRM record? So what I'm doing here, because it's a web, is I'm adding two properties to the property bag of the site, and I'm adding the ID and the type name of the CRM entity, and this uniquely identifies a record in the dynamic CRM system. And then I make sure that these are updated, and well, I execute query again to make sure that everything is sent to the server, that it's actually executed. Now, one of the things here, this is a website, so I can use a property bag. Imagine that you use just folders. You could always just store it as attributes on the folder if you add side columns or on a document library or wherever you are. Okay, so now that we have the helper method, I'll just quickly do the plugin create code. So what's happening here? Basically, I get the local context, which is my context from my plugin. I define it in a local field so that I can use it for my helper methods. And then the first thing I'm doing is I'm getting the default SharePoint site. So the first thing we did today was, okay, we needed to configure SharePoint from CRM. And then, well, we installed the component, or it was already installed, and then you need to enable it for entities. You select the location. Getting the default SharePoint site is, hey, CRM, give me what location is configured for you. Now, this is a helper method, which is, of course, also beautifully in a plugin. So what this does is simply connecting to the organization service context using the local context, so what I'm getting from the CRM system, the environment, the plugin, and I'm doing a link query that is getting the SharePoint sites on CRM where, well, the SharePoint site has a property, it's the default. Now you see I'm still getting some red lines on SharePoint site, and I saw that also before when I was strongly typing that I wanted to use a clause named WCO project. Now there's two options when you're working from plugins, is you can work untyped using the entity clause, and then you're basically working with a dictionary, or you can work typed and generate strongly typed clauses for everything you have in your CRM system. Now you have a command line tool for that, is CRM Service Util, but the Developer Toolkit and the CRM Explorer window offers you an option to right-click on the entities and generate the wrapper. And this will create all the entities in a strongly typed fashion. Now, because that takes a while, I'm going to just add it as an existing item. So it added the entities clause. It's basically a file with all the wrapped entities which I have on CRM. And then I can start working with that. So automatically generated. You can do the same using the CRM Service Util tool, and then it also strongly types or creates strongly typed versions of all your entities. Okay, so now this should be recognized. What is happening next? I'm getting the project which is being created. I'm getting that from the context. And then if the project is there and the default site exists, what I'm simply doing is I'm calling the create SharePoint site, the helper method we saw before. As a next step, I update my project to say, hey project, this is your SharePoint site. The out-of-the-box integration is very good for like storing locations to a folder or library because you have that visual integration where you see the library or the folder. You can also use it for like linking it to a regular site, and it will just display the iframe with a site in it. But for my end users, I want to make sure that there is a link on the CRM form that says, okay, here is a SharePoint site. If you want to open it, click here. So that's the update to CRM. And then there's an important step which is happening here. You need to associate your CRM record with the actual location for your documents. So where we saw before that you have two kind of entities for SharePoint management on CRM is SharePoint sites for getting sites, and you have SharePoint document location for actual locations of documents. So what happens here is I simply say, okay, my project is linked to a SharePoint document location, and what's the URL of that document location? You can use the absolute linking, or you can use relative linking. Now, one thing before I deploy, which I will have to change, is when I'm registering, it's currently in isolation mode sandbox. Now that's going to be a problem because I'm using the client object model, so I'm using these other assemblies, and well, that's impossible. It's just the same as for CRM Online. So one of the possible workarounds would be to use an IL merge, so that your assembly is merged with the SharePoint client object model, so that you end up with one big assembly, and then you can deploy that one big assembly to CRM. The only issue that you encounter sometimes there due to the IL merge and bringing all the assemblies together is that your assembly becomes too big and that it's not allowed to have, well, these assemblies on a CRM Online environment. In CRM On-premise, you can control the size which is allowed. Okay. And then the last step is just I can deploy. So you can right-click here. I'm going to make sure that I see that everything builds. I think we got one error there, and that's just one using statement because we are using a link. Okay. I'll do a deploy, so you can right-click the package, do a deploy, it will build it, and it's going to automatically deploy it to SharePoint, to CRM. Okay, so we see what's happening here. The deploy has started, and we see deploy succeeded. So now I turn back to my environment, Dynamic CRM. I go to my projects, and I'll create a new project, because my plugin will be triggered on the creation of a project. I'll give it the simple name TechDays, which is 10 Mondays, and I just save it. So this is going to take a while now, especially as the first time that this is happening, and I choose to have it synchronously. Usually I would do that asynchronously, but at least we'll immediately see the results. So what it should do now is going to CRM, get the default site, use the default site to go to SharePoint, create a new subsite there using a specific template, and then come back, give me the URL, and update that URL on the project. And that's what happened here. What I also did was linking, then, as a second step, this project to a specific document library on that SharePoint site. So if I click on Documents, I see that I have my document location, which I named Project Files, and I can start working with that. As you can see, it's a template. There's already, for example, a custom column defined on this library. And then again, it's the same story as before. I can add my documents, and I can continue working. So what you see now is, for example, technology. Technology is also a field which I have on CRM. So it would have been nice that this technology was already pre-filled with my data from CRM. So now I have to do it manually. Our next step will be to automate this also as a step. If you go back to maybe complete that for next time. If you open up the site, I get a site, I see my document which was uploaded, and I get a bunch of other templates, things that I provided on the template. So now I get a site per project, and I'm controlling provisioning automatically. Every time I create a project, a site is created, a document library on the site, and I link that document library on the site to this record in CRM. Okay, so that's the controlling of provisioning. Know that you have a few possibilities there. I didn't use the web services. With the web service, you pretty much do the same thing. You just add service reference to the web service, and then you start, or you can work with that web service reference. The only challenge there, of course, is that, well, it's a mixed web service. Will have to create the binding from code yourself. Okay, so what's the next common scenario? It's the opposite direction. I said, well, it would be nice that when I add a document, that automatically the document has the right attributes, the right metadata filled in from the CRM location. So what are my options when I'm going from SharePoint to, well, something else, in this case, CRM? It's pretty much the same thing. You can extend workflow using custom workflow activities, or you can do something very similar to a plugin, is defining an event receiver. Event receiver is exactly like a plugin. You can imagine it the same way. You create a class, you link it to a certain action that happens on SharePoint, and then your code will be executed. Going back to CRM, my options are really simple. There's one, I can talk to the services. So these are WCF services. There's also an OData service, but you can only use the OData service from within CRM itself. For example, when you create a Silverlight component that you deploy in CRM, then you can use the OData endpoint, because then the authentication is taken care of. If you're coming from an external system like here, then you can only use the WCF services. Okay. There's just one challenge in both situations, and that's that Dynamics CRM is .NET 4.0 and SharePoint is .NET 3.5. So if you look at the standard assemblies we're getting, the SDKs, well, we have different .NET versions. So what are some of the solutions? Well, if we're coming from CRM, we're going to SharePoint, well, we just saw it in the demo, we can use a SharePoint client object model. I mentioned that this might be a challenge for CRM Online, so you might try a workaround using IL merge. You can, of course, also use the SharePoint web services, and then the third option, of course, is to create a custom web service that talks to the SharePoint server object model. But of course, it depends on the environment where you are, if you can deploy that WCF service. Opposite direction, from SharePoint back to CRM. Well, there's one option. You can use the CRM WSDL-based endpoint. So instead of using the assemblies you're getting from the SDK, simply use a WSDL-based endpoint. It will generate the classes for you. Then there are some extra steps that you need, some extra extensions on that generated class to make it work. And there's actually a very good example of that in the CRM SDK. And also Girish Raja spent a lot of time on this. Actually, he, on his blog, has spent also some sessions on for example, Ticket, about this exact topic. So you might go to his blog also and find out these assemblies or these helper assemblies that he created so that you don't have to do everything yourself. So certainly, if you need this, certainly take a look in the SDK, go to Girish's blog so that you don't have to recreate or reinvent the wheel, basically. Okay, so let's do a little demo on that one. Creating that is very similar as what we did with plugins. Actually, creating an event receiver, this time built in Visual Studio 2010, I can add a new project, and there's SharePoint projects for me. So one of them is creating an event receiver, so I can create a new project, the sync event receivers. Okay. And then it asks me where I want to deploy this event receiver. The nice option here is that I can also deploy it to a sandbox solution, which means I can also use this for a SharePoint online environment. In this case, I will just deploy it as a farm solution. I'm in premises. I can do everything I like. Okay. And then it's again similar to what we did to the plugin. Okay, so you want to create an event receiver. When do you want to execute that event receiver? Oh, I like to execute it when something happens on SharePoint with one of the list items. What kind of list item? Well, when something happens on my document library, when a document is added, or when it's updated, I want to have my own custom business logic. So what I'll do in this point is when something is added, I will do a request to CRM, ask for all the metadata, and then use that metadata to update the properties on my document in SharePoint. Okay. So what do I need to do? Well, there's a few steps now because I cannot directly use the CRM assemblies, the CRM references. So what I need to do is use the WSDL-based endpoint. So it's basically adding a service reference to my WCF service from CRM. Just make sure it's there. I'll call it XRM services as a namespace. And then it will generate the WSDL-based endpoint. Now, if you would immediately start using that WSDL-based endpoint, you're going to encounter some problems. Stuff like, hey, I was expecting a collection, an entity, and there's an attribute collection on the entity, and one of the things returned in the attribute collection was not expected. A known type which was not defined on WCF. So that's the reason why in the SDK, in the documentation, and also what Girish did, is creating some extension classes so that you don't have to worry about making sure that all the known types are defined and updating the generated service reference class all the time. So what I'll do is simply reuse those extensions. So if you look at those extensions, what is it? Well, it's a bunch of defining of known types. What can be returned by an organization request? What can be returned by an organization response? And so on and so on. And then some helper methods to simplify your life when you're working with these collections that were generated in the service reference class. So you don't have to rewrite that all over the time. Just go to the SDK, copy that code, and use it in your assembly. And if you want, you can even extend it further to make it even more easier. And then we are basically done. What you need to do to connect is you can get the organization service client. So this is the class which was generated by adding the service reference. You define your connection, basically your WCF ABC, your address, binding, and contract. And well, in this case, because we're going to CRM using the WSDL-based endpoint, it's a basic HTTP binding. Nothing special there. I'm connecting, I specify the endpoint address, which is local, and I set my impersonation level. And then I can use that client as a proxy to talk to CRM services. So one of the options I'll be doing here is the following code. So first thing is happening from the context, from the properties, I'm getting the web on which this action is happening. I get the two properties I stored when I created the site. Remember when we had the plugin that created the SharePoint site that said, hey, there's two lines here are adding the CRM ID and the CRM type name to the SharePoint property bag. Well, here I can use that because something happens on SharePoint and I need to know, hey, I need to go to the project in CRM and find the information there. So I'm getting these properties right now. And then what happens is basically I ask CRM using the proxy, hey, please get me the technology this project is on. And then I update the technology attribute on the list item. And that's what's happening. So to avoid me having to complete that and to win some time, I'll switch to a prepared one, where I have two event receivers, one which exactly does what I just explained. There's also one for updating. Just as an example, what you can do is, let's say that someone changes the technology on SharePoint and that you want to update that in CRM. It's basically the same story. In the item added case, we say, okay, something is added in SharePoint, get the property and I update SharePoint. In the updated case, I just wanted to show the opposite. Something is changed in SharePoint and I want to update CRM. Just using the same methods, the same classes, the same concept. Another thing is a time event receiver, a more useful scenario. Let's imagine indeed that you have a project management module in Dynamics CRM. So your project managers are managing the entire structure and relationship in there. All your developers and resources working on the project will probably not be users of Dynamics CRM. So I'm exposing to a broader audience my project information using the project site which was created. There's information about the project on that site. And then, for example, what they could do is when they register time registrations in SharePoint. So all the detailed time registrations go to SharePoint. And of course, what do I need to know in my structured data in Dynamics CRM is not all the details maybe. I just need to know, okay, and where are we today? What is the actual for today? How many days were spent by all the developers, or maybe by specific developers? So I can start combining the best of the two worlds. CRM for a limited audience, which is very known in relational domain model. And then I can expose some of that information to a broad audience, all the resources, which can manage their time registrations. The nice thing about this SharePoint template is that you can also do an F5 deploy. So it will create the solution. It will deploy it to SharePoint and it will immediately activate it also. So it's still activating. So what I'll do in the meantime is from my project I created before here, TechDays. Okay. I'll open my site. And what we saw, and I was maybe too quickly here, is that the actual days are, well, there's no information on it. If I now go to my TechDays site, just want to make sure that it's deployed. Oh. Probably already deployed. Okay. So if I'm test registration, actual work, 8 hours, save it. And then it went wrong, so let's see. Okay. So, something went wrong, it's Murphy. It was bound to happen. I'll just try if I can retract the package. And try deploy again. If that doesn't work, I will have to continue. Or I can ask one of the SharePoint experts in the room. I see there are some of them here. Oh. Oh yeah, you're right. So stupid. Okay. Yeah, what I could do is, of course, make sure that the plugin assemblies, that I delete them. Okay. Still an error. Okay. Still the same duplicate key. I probably have to remove something on CRM, which I think the other plugin. I'm not going to spend any more time on it. I'm sorry. So what happens really in the time event receiver is basically the same thing. You get the IDs from SharePoint, you get the organization service client to communicate with CRM, and then you basically update the project to tell, hey, here is a new actual value. So let's see what other options we have. Okay. Now, extensibility points number 3 is the UI integration. What if I want to compose the UI and create a mashup? What are my options? Well, first of all, it's very simple. You can use iframes within CRM. And then we'll link it to SharePoint. What you could do is create SharePoint pages that have a stripped out master page, so that you're not getting all the SharePoint headers and so on. Another option is to use web resources. You can create Silverlight or HTML5 controls that then talk again to the services and will have your own UI created in there and mixed inside the Dynamics RAM out-of-the-box UI. There's, of course, the option to extend your navigation and your ribbons. So, for example, if you want to use search and expose search directly in CRM, what you can do is extend your navigation, have a link to your SharePoint search page. Opposite direction is pretty much the same. You still have iframes, which we can use. We can use web parts, Silverlight web parts. We can use the BCS, so Business Connectivity Services, to display external list data coming from CRM. I have search. I can use all of these to bring data from CRM into the UI of SharePoint. And then, of course, there's also the option to change the navigation, the ribbons. You can customize the actions you have on SharePoint. So you have many possibilities there too. I want to focus a little more on the BCS, the Business Connectivity Services. I'm not going to explain all the details of the architecture here, but what BCS basically does is really simple. It gets data from an external source, could be a database, a web service, or a custom assembly, brings that into SharePoint. SharePoint stores these things as external content types. Then there's a secure store service, which basically helps you with login mappings. Maybe I am Wim on one system, but my login on a second system is Wimco. So the secure store service helps you creating these mappings. And then, of course, there's a bunch of out-of-the-box web parts for displaying these external data. You can use it in search, you can use it in workflow, you can use it as columns on existing lists. You can basically expose it to the SharePoint web environment. At the opposite side, we see the Office client. Office client which can do the same thing. Office client can talk to the business connectivity services on the server, can cache those things locally, can work entirely offline if you're using the SharePoint workspace, and then of course you can expose your CRM data or line of business data also that way in Office. Now, one thing which is important is this external content type. The external content type basically defines where you're connecting to and what you're getting from that system. And then this can be used in the SharePoint server website or even in the Office clients, online or offline with the SharePoint workspace, but also you can use these BCS columns, for example, on the document information panel, which you're getting when you open a Word document. Okay. So, important is I have choices on how to connect. The BCS allows me to connect to many different source systems. So when going to CRM, I could, of course, again use the web services. Now, to help you, Girish Raja, which I mentioned before, created a BCS connector. What this does is two things. First of all, it will generate a model, a BCS model for you based on what you configure, so that you don't have to worry about creating all the requirements for creating the external content lists. It will also create a local WCF service, which serves as a bridge between your SharePoint environment and your CRM environment. And then you can simply connect the BCS to that local web service. And everything is managed by the connector. So you don't have to worry about all the details. What you have to worry about is really just defining which entities you want to retrieve and what attributes on that entity you want to retrieve and expose to CRM. And as soon as that is done, you can put it as a bridge between your BCS service and your CRM online or CRM on-premise. If you want to use the same thing for a CRM on-premise environment, you might probably need to modify some BCS connector elements, but you get the entire source code, so that's perfectly possible. The other option, of course, is to just connect to the database, which I'm doing in this case. Okay. So I prepared this already because you don't want to see me clicking everywhere for defining the BCS model. We'll certainly look how to do it. So where you can configure this BCS model, you can do that from Visual Studio, or you can simply use the SharePoint designer to do that. And then when you're defining this model, it's deployed using the BCS services. One thing to keep in mind, and this is important and a change since SharePoint 2007, is that the BCS functionality is already available from the SharePoint Foundation. The only difference, and it's a big difference, is that you're not getting all the web parts to display and visualize that BCS data on your SharePoint sites. But this means that already from a SharePoint Foundation, you can start working with BCS, and then if you want, you can create your own custom web parts that instead of talking to the CRM service directly, talk to the BCS service. The advantage of creating that web part is that you can reuse it from other solutions too. Because BCS is really this hub which is bringing together data from different systems. So instead of spending time and money on creating a web part that would be specifically to Dynamics CRM, you could spend that money on a web part that connects to the BCS and gets data from BCS. And then, well, if someday you need it for something else, you can use that too. Of course, it depends on the skills and the knowledge you have. Okay. What we see here in the meantime is that I've used one of these out-of-the-box web parts, so which you only get in the higher-end licensed version of SharePoint, where I have a list. I can have a related list, so whenever I select Dynamics CRM, I get the related projects. These are all coming from CRM. And then I can get the details on that specific project. I can add actions like view the profile or, for example, edit in CRM. And this can be a custom action that directly opens the record in CRM, which I can then manage and modify directly. So normally, if I would change this to CRM migration TechDays, if the screen is refreshed, I will see that this is updated also. Well, there we go. Now there's an option which BCS also offers, is caching. So that instead of having to go to the system every time, some of the data is cached locally on SharePoint so that you can speed up the connections and that you don't have to make a connection to the source system every time. Okay. A second thing which you can have as soon as you have BCS, and if you have search, is that you can expose all that BCS data to search. So in that case, you could say, okay, well, I can define my search, and on that search site, I can add a specific scope. So that user can select, I want to search everywhere, or I want to search only in the CRM data. So where I can search for like, I don't know, migration. Or one of my accounts, or whatever is configured in my model. So I see one of the results here, and I can immediately open it by clicking the details. Of course, what I didn't do now is, the result here isn't that beautiful, but you can, of course, configure the results web part here and make sure that if something is encountered from BCS in a certain entity of a certain external type, that you get a beautiful display on what it is about. And I'm using here, well, one of the generated profile pages. So that's what you can see in the URL is not that beautiful URL. What you could do is also create a known custom page where you display the details of that project and then use that instead of the out-of-the-box profile page. Now, how does this work? It works pretty simple. You just need to configure these things using your BCS model. And this happens from the SharePoint designer. Okay. Nice. Let's do it this way. So if I look to external content types here, I see that I have 3 external content types, the contacts, the accounts, the projects, the technologies, which I saw on the BCS site. Now these external content types, while creating a new one is very simple. You just click OK that you want to create a new external content type. When you're defining this external content type, you're defining the external system where you're connecting to. So in this case, database connection. And then you also define the detailed operations. What can you do? I have reading the list, reading items, associations with other entities which are in my external list. So with the reading list, this is basically a query that you provide. As soon as you're ready with all this information and you save this, this is actually saved to the SharePoint central administration, or better, the BCS service. And in the BCS service, you can then configure these things, like who has permissions to use that. You can go to search and configure search and say, okay, will I use an extra content scope so that users can select, oh, I just want to search within the CRM data or within my sites or within whatever scope you want to define. So whenever you're saved, these entities are created here, and then you see the details on those. From here on, I can create new actions. From here on, I can also go to the search configuration. And on search, I can define stuff like, okay, I need an extra content source. which is coming from CRM data. And one of the options there, one of the conditions, is that you select, okay, one of the content source is from external data, the BCS service, from a specific external data source, or from all the external data sources. And then this is available in search, and you can start working with that in search. You can use that in your scopes, so creating a scope that only uses that resource. You can use that in your metadata properties. So for example, when you're in advanced search and you say, okay, I want to search for documents or for elements where these and these keywords are true, but where the account is. So in advanced search, where you can select the properties, well, you can say, well, from the external list, account, managed metadata property, is matched to a specific field in my external list. Okay. So brief demo on that, pretty common in the BCS SharePoint world. Now, what are the key takeaways from these extensibility points? Is the choice of extensibility point is really important. You have to worry about where are you. Are you in a sandboxed or in a non-sandboxed environment? Depending on that, you can choose which extensibility points to use. For example, remember the client object model. These are external assemblies. They are not available in a CRM online. You might try to solve that using IL merge. You can use a SharePoint server object model only if you have control over the server. So if you can deploy a custom web service, which is, for example, not possible on Office 365 with SharePoint online. Then, don't forget about BCS. It's a very powerful feature. It's already available from SharePoint Foundation. Okay, in that case, you don't get all the features like all the web parts for displaying all these things. And you don't get the search and connecting that to the external data. But it's very powerful. You can, instead of creating custom code that works with CRM directly, talk to the BCS services. And this will also be an enabler towards Office applications. And then we didn't do it, but don't forget that you can extend the UI to create a powerful mashup. Because bringing these two products together, CRM and SharePoint, yes, they are better together, but you also need to worry about things like, what will be my end user experience? Does he have to switch environments all the time, from CRM go to SharePoint, from SharePoint go to CRM, or is it visually integrated? What is beyond the common? And there you can really be creative and use your imagination. You can imagine document routing. Instead of SharePoint users having to worry about, oh, standard CRM says a document library for the accounts, and then a folder for the specific account. If I want to store something for an account or for a customer, I need to go to that specific folder and save it there. Well, what you could do is use document routing and say, okay, user, here is a central drop-off library. Just drop your document in there and tell that it's for a certain account, and SharePoint will take care of routing it, of storing it to the right location. So that's not a difficult challenge, it's just not so common. Other nice things would, of course, business intelligence, using reports and KPIs and dashboards which you expose in SharePoint. It's combining with the social capabilities. Imagine tagging and liking and discussion boards directly on entities which you have in CRM. You can think about Office extensions, like an extra custom action pane which displays data from CRM right when you're working with your Office document, so that whenever you're creating a new project document, that you can just select the customer data and the project data from CRM directly or through the BCS services. So there's a lot of possibilities. If you really become like a CRM SharePoint hero, there's two things you should know. You should know the extensibility points, and you should know the functional features that each product has. And if you know these two, there's amazing things that you can create. There's a little demo here about using these extensibility points. One example, of course, I didn't mention it before, but there's possibility to connect to CRM using read-only data access to the database. Of course, it doesn't work with CRM online, because there you don't have access to the database. If you're in a CRM on-premise, you can do that. You can use that for the BI semantic model and then expose that using Power Pivot or Excel or reports or dashboards you're creating on SharePoint. Note, by the way, how I strategically positioned the BI semantic model label. I was thinking about having a background too, but well, I didn't do it at the end. Document routing, really simple feature. We have 1 minute to do that. Okay. Okay. So what you have on SharePoint as one of the features is you have this content organizer. As soon as you activate this feature, this content organizer, you're getting this drop-off library. Now you can then deploy on the drop-off library, you can define what kind of documents can I have stored or dumped in the drop-off library directly, or a drop-off library can also be configured with a certain email address, or it has an own web service URL, so that from anywhere you can just send the documents or the items to the drop-off library, and the drop-off library will take care of storing it, bringing it to the right place. So, if I use somewhere a document, and I added a custom content type that asks for the content for the account name. If I say that the account name is I can submit it, and you see that immediately says me, okay, it has been dropped. It has immediately been sent to under the account library, the Delaware Consulting folder, and there the document. So this way, my end users that are using SharePoint don't have to worry about, oh, I need to go to the right place, because if I don't do that, the users in SharePoint, in CRM, sorry, will not see my document. No, you can configure here, very simple, document routing, define with a few rules, and these rules are also managed in the site settings, where you can say, okay, what are my rules for routing the document to the right place? So I simply have, if the content type is CRM document, we'll look at the account name and we'll make sure we send it to the right folder in the account library. Okay. So that kind of brings us to the session summary. I didn't show all the possibilities, and one of them actually failed because of my duplicate key on my example. But you can see that you can get started really easy, very quickly. You have the out-of-the-box experience, which is about document management, visually integrated in CRM. If you want to go beyond that, it's no rocket science. You can reuse your skills. If you're a CRM developer, it's the same skills. It's still Visual Studio, it's still .NET, it's these kind of things. You just have different SDKs. But we saw when we talked about it that they are very similar. You just need to keep the extensibility points in mind. What are my options for integrating, and what is my best option now? What is my environment? Am I online or not online, sandboxed or not sandboxed? What are my options? And then think about the functional possibilities. Be creative and extend as required, and put the strengths of both products together. Become a real hero if you know the features and if you know the extensibility points. So if there's one thing that I can leave you here is, okay, think about the extensibility points, what are my options, and then if you know the features, the functional features of both products, you can really be creative and create amazing things. Okay, thank you.